Hello and welcome to today's episode of Date in a Blink, where we're excited to host Kat Vellos, a connection coach and trusted expert on the power of cultivating meaningful friendships.
Modern dating sucks, but it doesn't have to. Here on the Date in a Blink podcast, you'll listen in on 10-minute voice-only speed dates between strangers. The experience is designed to move people beyond mindless swiping and marathon messaging. Our position on online dating? It's time to stop collecting pen pals and start, going on actual dates.
Online dating? That actually involves dating? Is that even a thing anymore? But for real, dating should be fun. We hope listening in inspires y'all to try new ways of meeting people. Tune in every other week to hear a new couple go on a date. In between, we'll talk to relationship experts about how the date went and what we can learn from it.
Will our handpicked podcast matches find love on these Blink dates? Or will they say goodbye to each other after 10 minutes and never look back? Tune in to find out.
Before we jump into today's episode, here's a quick word from our sponsors.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain a bit. It's totally free, and Anchor will distribute the podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and lots of other podcasting platforms. Not only that, but it has creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. It also lets you make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make your podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
We're here on Date in a Blink today with Kat Vellos, a connection coach and trusted expert on the power of cultivating meaningful friendships. In her former career as a user experience designer, she researched, designed, and advised on the user experience of countless flows and digital products serving millions of people at companies like Slack and Pandora. With the publication of her books, We Should Get Together and Connected from Afar, Kat turned her background in UX design towards combating the loneliness epidemic to help millions of people experience greater wellness and fulfillment through thriving platonic relationships. Her interviews can be found in a variety of publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Communication Arts, Thrive Global, Yahoo Lifestyle, and Authority Magazine. Kat is also a sought-after speaker who has graced the stages of TEDx, San Francisco Design Week, Design for America, the Transforming Loneliness Summit, Rosenfeld's Media Design Ops Summit, and many more. Kat, thank you so much for joining us today on this podcast. We're really looking forward to being able to talk to you and learning about your expertise in helping people experience greater authentic connections with each other. And you've listened to Mike and Sasha's date. And before we dive in to talk about that, we have some other questions for you.
Thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
In your TED Talk, you mentioned something called tropical small talk. And it seems like you weren't the biggest fan of it, and I definitely don't blame you on that. Is there ever a time when you think small talk is helpful or appropriate? And do you think that small talk is always a means to an end?
Yeah. So in the TED Talk, the tropical small talk was very context-based, the fact that I was like in this tropical area and people were having the same conversation over and over again. And I do think that there are some cases where small talk is fine, right? It's a brief warm up to a real conversation, hopefully, and emphasis on brief and warm up. If you are going to be just talking to someone for a minute, like let's say you're at a checkout counter at a store, sure, a little bit of small talk is nice because it's acknowledging another person's humanity. You don't have a lot of time. You're just going to keep it brief. And I think that's fine. I do think that it's also useful when we are using it as a warm up to a real conversation to sometimes switch up the questions that we ask and to make sure that we're keeping that small talk as the on-ramp to the conversation and not actually getting stuck there permanently, like an entire long conversation. Like to me, like hell would be having to have long conversations that consist of nothing but small talk, like an entire evening of a dinner party or an entire weekend where all you do is small talk. So I think it's nice to switch it up if it feels appropriate, and even just asking different kinds of questions that are a little bit off the general script that we often use. So typical small talk questions could be things like, so how are you? What do you do? Where are you from? Things like that. And a small tweak on these can make a conversation a little bit more alive if you are using that as the type of warm up to your conversation. And that's actually the topic that you want to talk about. So you might say instead, how was your morning? Or tell me something that you like about the work you do. Those are a little bit different than just what do you do? how are you? And it makes it clear that you actually are curious to know the answer and you're not just using this question as a greeting, which is also something that happens very frequently. And it's unclear, is this person actually curious or are they just saying hello?
I actually love that you brought this up specifically, and especially so soon to when we first actually got on this call today. So I wasn't obviously recording at that time, but I had asked you how you were today, and your response was, let me tell you something funny that happened this morning. And it's so funny because the second you did that, I thought to myself, that was a really great way to change the conversation from a simple hello into a whole other conversation about some interesting things that cropped up for us from you sharing that story of something funny that did happen this morning. So you're definitely so incredible, your expertise with that. It was so natural. Sometimes I feel when I try to do things like that, it comes off as super awkward. And so I'm curious if you have any tips on how to make it maybe sound a little less awkward.
I want to hear the funny story. I missed it.
So when Laura asked me the question, how are you? I said, let me tell you the funniest thing that happened this morning. She said, sure. And I said, this morning sitting at my desk, I picked up a glue stick and almost applied it as chapstick.
Oh, no.
I have my chapstick and my glue stick in the same location, and I should probably split them apart. They're almost the same shape. And I was taking off the lid and I was like, that's the wrong one. That is not my chapstick.
This smells different.
It's different. It smells different. It looks different. So yeah, I think it's really just so much more engaging when we switch it up. And even if somebody asks you a small talk question and you're not sure, are they just saying hi or do they really just want me to say, fine, how are you? It's always okay to toss back something else that's fun. Maybe something really heartwarming happened this morning, and no one's going to start a conversation by being tell me something heartwarming that happened this morning. They might, but it's also okay for you to volley that back and be can I tell you about this thing? And usually when you're excited or kind of lit up about something, somebody else is going to want to hear about it. They can tell.
So this actually leads pretty well into another question that we have for you. So we know that, you were kind of inspired to tackle this tropical small talk issue and other communication challenges. And you created what is called kind of lightning talk events, where people are given 5 minutes to talk about their passion, knowledge, and interests. And we find it fascinating. And it sounds like a ton of fun, to be honest. And so we're wondering if you think that this can be translated into the dating setting, and if so, how?
Yeah. And to be fair, I don't want to take total credit for inventing the lightning talk format. It's really popular. A lot of organizations do it. A lot of community groups do it. It's just one of those things that's out there. And I think anybody who has the gumption can set up an evening or an event that's a lightning talk.
Mm-hmm.
The way it works is, each person signs up. They get 5 minutes to talk about anything that they're knowledgeable or passionate about. And the 5 minutes are theirs, right? They have the stage. They can do whatever they want with it, whether they include slides or just tell a story or anything like that. And I think it would be a marvelous activity for dating situations. For example, getting a bunch of singles together who want to meet each other, because what this gathering does is it gives you a chance to see what somebody's passionate about again or knowledgeable about without having to go on all these one-on-one separate dates. And the way the gathering is set up, it gives you this explicit permission to show off, what do you know about? What are you excited about? And you don't have to worry that you're hogging up all the attention in a conversation or that you're bragging, because you're on stage. It's your time to shine. And so during that night or that event, everybody gets to see how everybody else shines. And the cool thing is you get to see how other people interact with others, what their sense of humor is like, what kinds of questions they ask, how their mind works, all of these rich observations that you can make when you see someone in a group setting. It's really different than when you're in a one-on-one date and it feels oh my gosh, do I have to perform or have to be perfect? And so it's just a really natural kind of way to interact and get to know other people. And a cool way to make it even more up the ante for a dating situation is that the host can say, by the end of tonight, at the end of the night, you have to ask one or two other people for their number. At the very end of the night, we're going to have a number switching, 10 minutes, run around and change numbers. And so that way, as you're watching the night, you're oh, who do I want to ask for their number? And then it takes away the pressure of being how do I ask that person to hang out again? It's everyone's going to do it. There's time for that. And you've had this chance to observe and learn about each other through the night.
Oh, I really enjoy that idea of essentially you're going somewhere and it's really nice when a facilitator creates the space for other people to enter in and to opt into doing something like that, because it can feel really awkward, I think, to do that naturally on your own.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so one thing I've noticed in conversation is that people sometimes will downplay their passions or their knowledge about something. And it seems that for some, talking about themselves can make them really uncomfortable or feel exposed. So I'm curious, how can a person break the ice in situations like this and foster a more open and comfortable communicative environment?
Good question. I noticed when I listened to the sample date that Sasha seemed to be doing that a few times. She's done a lot of impressive things, a lot of interesting things, and she shared about them in this like very humble, very subtle way. And it's important that people create the stage for other people to open up, right? And you do that by showing a really warm curiosity about the other person. And one way that I think it makes it more inviting and feels safer to open up is in how you frame the question. So, for example, there's a difference between saying, "So, what's your job like?" which is, pretty vague, pretty open-ended, that's fine. But it's really different than saying, "I love learning about what lights people up in their career, like their proudest moments or the bright spots. So, in this next question, I invite you to brag a little bit. I would love to hear about what have been some of the high points for you in the work that you do." And then sit back and listen. Don't interrupt. Like, let them really fill in that space. Tell about the really cool things that they've done or the things they're proud of. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to asking questions on a date, and even like I talk about friendship all the time, is that this has been proven. There was a 2017 Harvard study that found that people who ask more questions are perceived as more likable. So don't be nervous asking questions. Know that you're making it easy for the other person to open up, and afterwards people tend to rate their conversation partner higher when they have shown that curiosity. And then if somebody offers you a really good, juicy question, open up, share, like give them something specific and detailed to learn about you with, and that will provide fodder for more like threaded follow-up conversation questions.
So that actually feeds really well into our next question. So, you talk in your TED Talk about the fear of rejection and how people are hesitant to extend invitations, but I think that extends also to, they're hesitant to open up and be vulnerable. And I think that's something that we can all relate to in some form. And we're curious if you have any advice for folks who want to build stronger connections with someone, but might still be harboring that fear of rejection. And if they are rejected, how do you shake it off?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rejection is a part of life. It's true. And it's one of the things, most people have a little bit of a fear of. They're concerned about it. It hurts, it stings a little bit. But I really say, like, try to see if you can lessen the fear of that by getting used to it. Like, there was this was probably over 10 years ago. I watched this really hilarious video. You can probably find it on YouTube, where this guy wanted to get over his fear of rejection. Like, he was going into business and he knew he was going to hear the word no a lot. And so to lessen his fear of rejection, he did an experiment where every day for a month, he tried to get someone to tell him no. And he would do really outlandish things, like go to a burger restaurant and after he ate his burger, ask if he could have a free refill on his burger. Like things that people were definitely going to say no to. And the goal was to get a no. And sometimes he got a yes. And he was like, "Oh gosh, I failed today. I got a yes." But it's really funny, and it really helps you realize that the more you hear no, the less scary it is. And another thing to keep in mind with getting a no is I find it something that I can be grateful for, because it is clear. When someone says no, you know where you stand. You know what reality is. They're not wasting your time. They're not stringing you along. It's not confusing. You don't have to wonder. There's a saying that rejection is redirection. All it does is tell you this is not where you should put your energy. Turn to another direction. And I recommend just putting your attention on the spark that's going to sparkle back at you, and just focus on that.
I love that.
Yeah, I feel like that's a very quotable quote. Focus on the spark that sparkles back at you. I love that. Yeah. And so this next question is a little related to something we were talking about earlier, but framed a little bit differently. So in a number of our episodes, there's occasionally a brief, sometimes awkward pause. And the most common question that we've noticed our daters will jump in with tends to be, "So what do you do?" And we did see that happen with last week's date between Mike and Sasha. So I'm curious, do you think a question like this is just a part of the normal process of getting to know someone, or have you found that people benefit from little nudges like a prompt in order to take their in order to take the conversational road less traveled?
So you mean a prompt like that you might provide them with, like, oh, when you don't know what to say, maybe pick one of these.
Yeah. Yeah. Or even just a list that they can reference. When we're starting the dates, we do ask them an initial prompt to get the conversation started.
Mhm.
But we're curious about, how do you continue a natural conversation? Is it unnatural to have a list of questions? Is it weird? Is it awkward? Is it beneficial? Is it helpful? Curious to know your thoughts on that.
I think it's definitely beneficial and helpful. In fact, I just released a calendar that has alternatives to all these like typical small talk questions, like what do you do? Because the thing is, we fall into these habits, right? There's certain scripts that are in our culture, like what do you do? Where are you from? Where'd you go to school? And it's so repetitive. And sure, these things can tell you a little bit about somebody, some context, but it may not be the most interesting or meaningful thing about them. And it might also be a question that they kind of like roll their eyes. They're like, oh my gosh, here we go with that again. And so I definitely think it's helpful to have other prompts that someone can refer back to. I think that if you gave that to the daters, that would be super helpful. You're welcome to grab resources on my website. I highly 101% recommend this.
We
And
are
I think,
totally going to link to this calendar. We're going to have to get that from you. But I have a question for you about this, actually.
yeah.
So Laura and I have actually talked about this separately. And the thing that my response to kind of do we, give folks more resources and questions to ask? My thought is it almost helpful to know, where someone's mind goes in those moments of silence? Because to me, it's really telling when somebody takes that moment of silence and asks like a really interesting question or refers back to something earlier in the date, as opposed to just kind of reverting to something like, oh, what do you do? Or, something like that. And I find that to be really telling. And so I find it interesting to hear where that natural conversation goes and reticent to redirect it. And so I'm curious if you think that it is almost an informative piece of information during a conversation, like you can then take it and process it as the receiver or the other person in the conversation of how you want to kind of continue your relationship with that person. If you think they're really interesting because they ask great questions, or if you think, maybe we're not, going to have the best conversations because they're not terribly inspired.
I see. What I'm imagining right now is there are two people in a conversation. Somebody shares something interesting. I'm thinking back to this particular date that I listened to,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a pause, and then the other person can either change the topic, like I saw Mike do a couple times, or instead say, "Are you open to sharing more about that, or do you want to maybe dive into one of these questions that jumped out to you, from this list or whatnot?" So you give them this list. And what I like about that is it invites an opt-in, right? So I'm thinking back. So one of the examples that she gave was about she had done LSD in Joshua Tree, right? Like that's a really juicy story. That is a big one to drop. She's like super vulnerable, super open right away. And maybe that's something that she's open to sharing more about. I mean, she brought it up. Like,
Mm-hmm.
why change the subject? Like that is really cool. Or maybe she said everything she wants to say about it. She's ready to talk about being a comedian now. And so I think asking someone like, are you open to sharing more about that? Or do you want to dive into, a different topic? Like what's on your mind? I think giving that choice is really generous. And with that, I think then by making it possible for the other person to say, what would interest them to talk about, whether it's a list you give them or maybe something that's just on their mind, is it invites the opportunity to say, like, what are you curious about? Which is really different than just what do you do?
Yeah.
Is this kind of like lining up with kind of your question? Because I think what's possible here is to say, where would you like to go in this conversation? Like, what would make this really, really good for you, rather than just we have to fill the time. Oh my gosh, let me like fill in the small talk question here.
Yes. And then that actually feeds well into another question we have for you. In those moments of, silence where you're trying to figure out where to take the conversation, especially on a first date, coming up with a great question can be really hard. And so I know you sort of answered this with two different directions, but I'm curious if you have any other advice advice that you would give someone who wants to improve their ability to ask meaningful questions. So, you can ask, do you want to talk more about that? But if they want to ask more meaningful questions, are there other ways that they can go about kind of improving that skill?
Mm-hmm. I would say improve your muscle for curiosity
Mhm.
and let yourself off the hook with feeling like you have to be the world's like greatest, most meaningful question asker. Cause that can sometimes make you feel a little bit nervous or like, oh, am I good enough? But instead just work on being really curious, like see what is fascinating about this other person, and then, sometimes you can even like play a little game in your head where you try to see if you can ask like 3 follow-up questions before you change the topic. I had an anecdote in my book, We Should Get Together, about this, where I had gone into work one morning and I saw a coworker and he says, "How was your weekend?" I said, "It was pretty good. I worked on some projects at home." And he could have stopped there, but he asked another question. He said, "What kinds of projects? Were they work projects or personal projects?"
Mm.
And I said, "Oh, well, it was a personal project. I was building some, small little altars with sentimental objects on them." And we could have stopped there, but instead he said, "Oh, are you into like woo woo stuff or something like that?" He said, "Are you a spiritual person?" And I said, "I'm not religious, but I guess I'm like a tiny bit woo woo." And he was like, "Oh, have you heard about this store that just opened in Oakland and they sell candles and affirmation cards and they have a really beautiful Instagram?" And he pulls it up. And so, like, by asking 3 follow up questions in 5 minutes, we were able to get so much closer and understand more about who each other were. And we found out that we both had this like slightly woo woo side and we like affirmation cards and little things like that. And that would have never happened if that conversation ended after the first question, "How was your weekend?" Right? Which is a
Mhm.
pretty generic question. But by both people being willing to like take the thread of that conversation, another loop and another loop and another loop, we got a lot closer and it didn't take long. And it wasn't that he was asking deep and meaningful questions. He was just curious. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Yeah. I think that's a really great tactic for, tactic sounds so formal, but that's the only word that's coming to mind for me right now. It sounds like such a great way to really build a connection with someone. And I like the idea of framing it as a little bit of a game because it can really, I think, help people feel less stressed out about, do I need to come up with a new question? And I can't remember if I saw this in one of your emails or if I saw this somewhere in the universe of communication. But one thing that I've been hearing a lot about lately is this idea of recalling. So when there's kind of a lull in a conversation, to bring it back to something that happened earlier and just ask to essentially, it's kind of like merging these two ideas of asking 3 questions before you change the topic,
Yes.
or reverting back to an original, not original, but something that was talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's such a fantastic technique to use in a conversation. And it's also one of the tenets of really good storytelling and really good comedy is it loops back and it brings you back to something that you heard before. That's often why punchlines are funny is they make a reference back to something that you already laughed at before.
Yeah. That's great. Also, I love that you said the word technique. I'm going to use technique now instead of tactic because that sounds much nicer. Anyway, in a conversation you had with Hurry Slowly host Jocelyn Glee, you talk about people's tendency to throw away relationships as soon as things seem less than perfect. And you express that because of this, people wind up missing out on a chance to grow and to heal. What are some tactics people can use to avoid becoming discouraged when challenges arise?
Honestly, it's just remembering that there's no relationship in life that's going to be 100% conflict free. Not anything, not friendships, not dating, not family. Like that's just not a realistic expectation is to think everything's always going to be positive and perfect 100% of the time. That's just not real. And so when we understand that and we can take that in and say this is a part of life, how can we hang with it? How can we heal from it? How can we get closer from it? Then we have richer relationships. We have robust, durable relationships that don't fall apart when they hit the first bump in the road, but they actually get stronger and you learn more about each other by getting through a challenge together. And so think of it more as an opportunity to say, whoa, how can we add another layer of depth to our relationship by seeing how we solve this problem together rather than, oh my gosh, there's a problem. I should probably never talk to you again.
Yeah, that I think is a really lovely technique for people to use to help deepen those relationships and see how well you can ride out that storm. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, transitioning a little bit to narrow in on Mike and Sasha's date in particular. So I'm curious, did you notice any areas in particular where Mike and Sasha's questions could have been improved? And if so, how?
Hmm. Yeah, I saw several missed opportunities there for engagement. So, an example is, you know, Sasha kept sharing really significant and specific details that were giving Mike opportunities to show his interest and curiosity and to learn more, right? Like I said, she shared the fact that she had done LSD in Joshua Tree, very specific, extremely, you know, unusual. She also mentioned that she had performed comedy at some of the venues that he had been to and venues that he admired. That was kind of like a very quiet mic drop. She's like, yeah, I performed there. And then she like lists like 10 musical artists that she likes. About they're talking about music festivals, and she's like, I like this and this and this and this and this, and I'm excited to go in March. And the next thing he says is, so what do you do? It's like, no, dude, like, she's giving you so much here. He works in video. She said she went to film school. It's like, oh my gosh, that's a really cool lineup. So there were all of these opportunities to dive into something really, really specific, this great buffet. And unfortunately, what I observed is that he kept reverting to small talk. He kept reverting away from this really juicy, specific, interesting, personal detail and moving either to, you know, something kind of light and kind of shallow, and also switching back to talking about himself, you know, in this kind of vague way. And so unfortunately, if I were to guess what happened here, I don't really feel like there was a lot of chemistry. There were so many missed opportunities. I don't know if I don't know what I would vote for this one. Probably a no. If they were going to go on any more dates, I would be very curious to hear what Sasha's feedback and takeaways were from that conversation. It didn't sound like a lot of chemistry to me, even though there was a lot of potential there.
And I am curious if there are any moments that stood out to you as ones of strong communication during the date.
Yeah, so I think that one thing that is really useful to keep in mind, especially in a situation like this, is to take a risk, right? So Sasha was vulnerable a lot of times. She shared a lot of specific details, and that takes vulnerability, and it can be hard to open up. Like the question you asked earlier of like, you know, it can be uncomfortable to feel like you're bragging or to feel like you're talking about yourself, but you have to open up. You have to give somebody something to work with. And I saw her doing that quite a bit. And I think that's a really great example of how to take, you know, even a basic question and fill it with something really specific and vibrant that can give more fodder for future questions, future curiosity, connection. And it takes courage to do that. And so I would say that's something that I think was a plus. And I encourage everybody to practice doing that.
Yeah. So what do you think about the overall momentum of the conversation, you know, where it started versus where it wound up?
It started, I mean, just with that mic drop. The question you left them with at the beginning was, you know, what's something that you would like to re-experience again? And she's like, boom, I did LSD in Joshua Tree. I want to do that again. You know? And I think that went to, the conversation kind of ebbed and flowed. There were these moments of like real specificity, real detail, you know, interest. And then it was like, let's like swim back to something safe. Oh, so what do? You know, and then it's like this, that, and the other. I created a startup, or I do stand-up comedy at night. Like, public speaking is the number one fear of people. And this is someone who not only stands up publicly to do public speaking, but tries to make people laugh. Like, that is really, really interesting. And so it's like, there's that, and it's getting interesting. And then, you know, and then it switches to something else. I just felt like it kind of had the ebb and flow of like, we're getting into interesting territory. It's getting juicy. And then it's like, oh, let's paddle back to like shore again. And there's this image I carry in my head of where a conversation goes. And there's like the shoreline, the shallow water where, you know, maybe you're like just doggy paddling around. And then there's like snorkeling down and seeing like coral. And then there's scuba diving where you're getting into the deep water. And a lot of times when people start to get into something more interesting, they get kind of scared and then they like float back to surface or swim back to shore. And I'm just like, just take a breath and stay there and see how that feels and see what you can ask next or share next that can keep you where you're at and maybe take you a little bit deeper.
All right, so we have the $1 million question. Date in a blink. What do you think? Did they match? I know you already kind of teased your sense, Kat, but I'm going to make you answer it again, and I'm going to give my guess, and Laura will give hers, and then she'll share what actually happened.
You know, there was a lot of potential here. Like I said, they had similarities around the interest in film and video, the interest in going to music festivals. You know, he likes going to comedy shows. She's a comedian. Like, there was so much potential. I really, really wanted them to be a match. in that first conversation, it felt a little bit awkward. So I was like, oh, I just don't know if this is going to be a match, like despite these commonalities. So I'm going to have to vote it. I would guess no, but I hope I'm wrong.
So I had the exact same feeling as you, that they had a ton of overlapping interests and places where they like seemed to be parallel, but they never really, they were like ships in the night, where they just were kind of talking past each other. So I was in this maybe camp. I know I'm sort of cheating. I should be saying yes or no, but I was in this maybe camp of, they might be willing to continue exploring the conversation because they had so much overlap, but I didn't get the sense that like the conversational vibe was jamming, so to speak. So I was in a maybe leaning no.
Yeah, so drum roll, please. They were not a match. So both of your guts were telling you correctly. So though the connection wasn't strong enough for them to continue the conversation, it was really interesting as we're talking about conversation and different setups and really helping people, skip the small talk, so to speak, and actually get to meet each other and talk to, a three-dimensional person as opposed to a two-dimensional profile. Some of the feedback that they did give about the format was that Sasha liked the setup, and Mike said that he thought it was cool, something different, and especially because it was so quick, it was easy to fit into his schedule. So I do think that though they were ships passing in the night, I think these ships might continue to sail the seas that are actually talking to people.
Yay.
All right, then. There's more fish in the sea, more ships out there.
Yes. There's more ships and more nets. All right. Well, Kat, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing more about your expertise on the power of cultivating meaningful connections with our audience. And definitely thank you for indulging us to see how we can apply this to people going on their first dates. Before we let you go, we have 2 remaining questions. So one of them is, what words of wisdom or advice do you have for the singles listening to our podcast? And lastly, how can our audience get connected with you?
So words of wisdom, I would say have fun, be yourself, and be curious. And if you want to connect with me, my website is weshouldgettogether.com. That's also the name of my book. And I'm on Instagram at Kat Vellos _author.
All right. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. This was so much fun.
Yes. That's all we've got for you today. Shoot us a message on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at The Blink Date or at Date in a Blink to let us know what you think. If you want to try voice-first speed dating from the comfort of your home, download the Blink Date app today. You can also sign up to participate in Date in a Blink by visiting our website at www.theblinkdate.com. In the meantime, thanks for joining us for this episode. We hope you enjoyed listening and look forward to talking with you again next time.